Mr Speaker.
Call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, on behalf of the Labor Party, we'll be supporting this legislation. It amends the Tariff Act 1988, basically to give preferential tariff rates to the Republic of Korea, that is South Korea, which is necessary in order for this country to ratify and bring into effect the free trade agreement that's been negotiated between our two countries. Korea is an important trading partner for New Zealand. It's our sixth biggest trading partner, and the two-way trade is somewhere in the vicinity of $4 billion. It was really necessary to bring this treaty forward. We began the process under the last Labor government when I was Minister of Trade, and I was deeply aware that with other competitor countries like Chile having already achieved a free trade agreement with Korea, then our exporters in a number of fields, for example in kiwi fruit, were losing their competitive advantage. Subsequently, the Americans and the Australians have moved to get a free trade agreement, and not to have an agreement of this nature would leave our exporters in an invidious and deeply uncompetitive position. So Labor will be supporting this. I want to congratulate our senior negotiator, Martin Harvey. Martin also was my senior negotiator in the free trade agreement that we negotiated with the ASEAN countries. So I know from personal experience he's a competent and committed negotiator, and I think he would, with the support of his minister, have got the best deal that he could from the Koreans. Having said that, I think I would share with Martin and his team and with the minister our disappointment that there were some areas in this free trade agreement that we did not get the progress and the comprehensive nature of the free trade agreements that we negotiated earlier with China and with Taiwan. We've got some areas where tariff barriers will remain in place indefinitely under the provisions of the treaty and this bill that brings it into effect. Important areas like the export of frozen squid are not brought in to the deal, and the tariffs remain on them. Unprocessed deer velvet, I think that's 60% of our deer trade with South Korea, is not covered by the agreement. There's some horticultural products that are left out of it. And importantly, milk powder being our single biggest exporter, outside the tariff rate quota, those tariff rates will remain. So there were disappointments in the treaty, but the problem that New Zealand faced in this negotiation, as with so many, is that we have very little negotiating coin because we have very little export barriers to, for example, trade from Korea coming in. We do have the ability, of course, to facilitate their entry into something like the TPP, and I'm sure that that was used to give leverage to our negotiators. The good thing about this agreement, Mr Speaker, is that it eliminates over time most of the $229 million that we pay, our exporters pay in tariff rates to the Koreans. And of our current exports, it removes tariffs on 98% of them. Now that figure distorts the reality of the picture that because milk powder tariffs remain in place, and that's not a high current export because of that tariff barrier, the agreement isn't quite as good as it seems on the surface, but it's certainly worth having. For example, for the kiwi fruit exporters, they were paying 45% tariffs. Chile by now had tariff-free entry into Korea. They are our major competitor. So that was an important gain, and that will come into effect in 5 years. Beef exports, we're paying 40% on. That will be eliminated in 15 years. Sheep meat, 22%. That will be eliminated in 10 years. We've will largely achieve duty-free forestry exports into Korea over 10 years and cheese and butter in 14 years. I think every party in the House that was on the Select Committee doing the treaty examination acknowledged there is a real net benefit to New Zealand in this treaty. The Greens certainly acknowledged that, and so did New Zealand First. But I think it's very hard to acknowledge that you're getting an important net benefit and that you will suffer quite serious competitive disadvantage if you don't sign the treaty and then vote against the bill. Now, I guess the other parties on the Select Committee in opposition are making a symbolic gesture because there are aspects, including the investor-state disputes procedure, that they don't like. But I think our position is, to be honest, if New Zealand is going to benefit from this deal, then we can't vote against it. It's illogical to vote against it if it is important for New Zealand and we get a good benefit from it. I want to touch on the investor-state dispute settlement because that was the area in the treaty examination that really drew the flack. And it was not about Korea. I don't think anybody thinks that Korea is going to take us to the investor-state disputes procedures any more than China or the ASEAN countries. They've been in place for 6 years. Nobody has taken us through the investor-state dispute settlement procedures. And Korea is extraordinarily unlikely to. But what happened with this bill, when we heard evidence on the treaty examination, it was used as a stalking horse for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And the concern that people had, and I think it's a genuine concern, is that the United States, as a litigious country, they might make use of that procedure. So we'll start our opposition to it under the Korea Agreement, even though we're not really against the Korea Agreement, but that fires our shots across the bow of the TPP should it go ahead. Well, I think the Select Committee procedure on the treaty examination was really useful and well conducted, and I acknowledge the chair and I also acknowledge the officials because it brought out the reality rather than the hype and rather than the scaremongering. And the reality is that in some trade agreements, NAFTA probably being one of them, the wording for investor-state disputes procedures was pretty loose. And there have been cases taken that people have interpreted as being a United States corporate being able to sue, for example, Canada because they've put an environmental protection in place. Well, the reality is slightly different than that. It's not any country has the right to put in place environmental protections, but when they do so, they've got to make sure that it's non-discriminatory between the nationals in that country and those that are trying to trade into the country, such as Canada. We found in examining some of those decisions, and I think looking at the minimum standard of treatment provisions that have been used by corporates to sue countries, Bilcon and Canada was a prominent example. But they explained in their decision what the standard of the problem of the grievance had to be in order to succeed before an ISDS procedure which was invoked. The actions of the government needed to be, quote, arbitrary, grossly unfair, lacking in due process, leading to an outcome which offends judicial propriety. That's not a low standard, Mr. Speaker. That's a very high standard. So I'm satisfied, and I think the officials satisfied everybody on the committee, that they have built into the wording of the investor-state disputes procedures sufficient safeguards that enable New Zealand to retain its sovereign right to legislate for the public good. For example, in public health, areas like plain packaging of cigarettes. I would not support an agreement that took away our sovereign right to stop tobacco companies promoting a product that causes death among 50% of New Zealanders that use those products. So I think there are safeguards built in there. The concern that I want to reiterate from David Parker, who raised it, was that the one area that is not covered would be the sale of residential land to overseas buyers. The Overseas Investment Act is protected. It's exempt under Annex 2. That means that we can continue to stop, or if the government had the will to stop, that is, the sale of farmland. But the officials were ambivalent about whether we could legislate to stop the sale of residential properties. Right now, Mr. Speaker, we've got house prices going through the roof, and there's no New Zealander that believes that foreign investors, wherever they come from, buying up and speculating in residential housing is helping the problem. It's making the problem worse. And unfortunately, the officials could not give us assurance that under this legislation, we would be able to expand the Overseas Investment Act to cover residential housing. The Australians have done that. They've made that a provision of their negotiation with Korea, and I think the government was remiss in not providing for that in relation to residential property sales under this legislation and this particular treaty. Mr. Speaker, with that exception, this is a bill that we can support. This is a treaty that will benefit New Zealand. We will be supporting that, but I think the government's going to have to try harder to make sure in every aspect of where we should maintain our sovereign right to legislate, we are able to do so.